You see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
I'm going to keep this super short because our presenter has kind of a long program. This is about a site that's just up the road here. If you haven't visited, it's well worth seeing. It's the Old Economy Village. Sarah Buffington is our presenter today. She actually works for the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, but she is the curator of the Old Economy Village up the road there in Ambridge, just by Ambridge. So I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to give us some history on the Old Economy Village and what's there and so forth and so on. So Sarah, take it away.
Thank you, Jock. Right. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So, I know the title of this might scare some people. That's not my intention, but it's actually the truth, and I'm going to tell you about it. So, first of all, I'm the curator at Old Economy Village. I've been there for 20 years. And in that time, I've learned a lot of stuff about Old Economy Village and the Harmony Society that lived there. How many of you have been there? Excellent. So you all know this history. So, okay, thanks, bye. Anyway, a little bit about my background. I came to Pennsylvania from Michigan. I am a graduate of Michigan State University. Sorry about the Penn State fans around here, but I graduated with a degree in apparel design and textiles with a historic emphasis. So how in the world did I get here? I also have a long history of Civil War reenacting. I became a Civil War reenactor in 1987. So that's a while ago. So I just have a love of history. I married a guy that I met in Maryland while I was filming a movie, and that was my husband, Scott Buffington. I don't know if any of you have met him, but he's also a history teacher at Elwood City Area School District in the high school. Am I blanking out on the
Just put it straight.
Put it straight.
Like that.
Okay. It sounded like I was not completely projecting. Okay. Anyway, I came to Pittsburgh and worked at the Pittsburgh Ballet Theater and Carnegie Mellon University Theater Department and the Pittsburgh Public Theater and many other places like that. And then I was also volunteering at Old Economy Village. But going back a little bit, at Michigan State University, I was employed at the Michigan State University Museum as well. So that was my entrance to being the curator here. So, Old Economy Village. Does anyone know what I mean when I say communism in our midst? A little bit, okay. So I know it might be a little scary, but I'm going to go into that. So, see how it works? Is it going to work? Oh, it's not on.
Yeah, I gotta turn it on.
Thank you. It's not working.
Here, I'll be at this. Okay, it's on, so it should be this one.
I was pushing, that's the wrong.
Middle button.
Okay.
And, this is the point.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
You gotta do that, John?
So I'm going to tell you the story about a group of people that's well documented by the largest manuscript group in Pennsylvania State Archives and a man named Carl Arndt. That's the man that you see there. He wrote 10 volumes about the Harmony Society history and dedicated most of his adult life to the Harmony Society's history. So the group of people was named the Harmony Society, and all in all, there was about 1,700 people that were harmonists. They came from Württemberg, Germany, in the beginning of the 19th century. They followed a charismatic leader named George Rapp, and that's where they came from, where the big red star is. He came from Iptingen, Germany, and he had people following him from miles and miles around. He had like 800 people following him in Germany. It was crazy. That's George Rapp. So this is the church where he grew up. He was raised Lutheran in Iptingen. But in 1785, in his mid-20s, George started attending private meetings with Pastor Gertz. And then he started learning about an alternate way of Christianity. He made a decision to stay away from the church because he wanted to be closer to Christ than a cold, formal religious service by university-trained pastors permitted. So that's what he thought of the pastors of the Lutheran Church. Lutheran was the state religion of Iptingen and Württemberg at the time. So he started to talk to friends about his religious fervor and returned to the original teachings of Christ, and he gained a massive following. George was called before the church council in April 1785, where he said the Spirit of God was instructing him. It wasn't right to stay away from church. Everyone needed to go to church. Very different from today, I guess. His first confession of faith was April 17, 1785 in Iptingen, and this showed the unofficial beginnings of the Harmony Society. In November 1786, 1 year later, the Lutheran pastor asked the group to come back to church and refrain from religious meetings, which were making more converts. There was too many people going away from church. In 1786, there was a child that started to refuse to go to school because God had instructed him. In January 1787, Rapp and his group said the pastor was not a servant of God and ministers could not forgive sins. God had forbidden them to go to church and communion. They claimed the official church was not the true church because its members had not all been reborn. In 1787, people refused to have their children baptized in church. In May to June 1787, 14 people were investigated at Iptingen. The findings were finally sent to the consistory 3 years later in 1790, but no action was taken against them until 1791. George Rapp was imprisoned in the church tower in June 1791, after which his following increased from great distances, 3,000 to 4,000 people. In January 1792, there was a talk of exiling the separatists, but it was decided not to because all of the people were not injurious to the state. But by this time, it had developed into an organized separatist body of primitive Christians. The Articles of Faith were presented to the Württemberg legislature in 1798 in Lomersheim to try and become a state within a state, which was not allowed because of the dense population. The articles left out celibacy and the communion of goods, which became a big thing for the Harmony Society later. Although celibacy was probably practiced by some by 1785. George Rapp himself, his last child was born in 1785, and they think that maybe he adopted celibacy in 1785. He only had 2 children, so that wasn't common. They had a lot more children usually in those times. And then there was the Malbrunn investigation, which took place in November of 1802. By then, Rapp had 10 to 12,000 people following him and was one of the wealthiest people in that area. The followers came from distances of 12 to 15 hours walk on feast days, and it was thought that the following might become a danger to the state. In 1803, a decision was made to send George Rapp and 3 others to America to look for land for their colony. They needed to get away from all of this persecution. So they came to America. Why did the Harmonists come here? They weren't Harmonists yet. The Separatists were in a religious panic, feeling like what was predicted in Revelations was taking place. George Rapp looked at current events and natural disasters that pointed to the fact that the end times were near and could happen really soon. This caused great excitement amongst them, and there was no room for tolerance. They believed that Europe would imminently destruct, and God would establish his kingdom in America. You know, the Second Coming happened a lot in many different times throughout history, so this was George Rapp thinking that it was coming in his lifetime. According to Revelations, St. John received special messages from Jesus Christ to 7 congregations. Only one of these received the divine stamp of approval, the church in Philadelphia, the Church of Brotherly Love. George Rapp considered the Harmony Society to be this congregation, as well as the Sun Woman in the Wilderness, also described in Revelations. They were to be a group of individuals who would survive the wrath before the millennium, and who would live and rule with Christ for 1,000 years. They did not want to leave Württemberg, but followed a divine calling. So they went to America to welcome Christ and to take part in a mysterious transfiguration of fallen man, to dwell in a transfigured world where there would be no tears. This ferment caused them to adopt celibacy, sexual abstinence, and preparation for the return to the holy state of virginity, which encompasses the masculine and feminine elements. In the kingdom of God, there would only be a man virgin, as Adam was, not a woman. Man and woman were one being. Or not a woman. Man and woman were one being. Okay. It's not exactly what we all think of today in Christianity, but this is what he was believing. George's son, John Rapp, was married in 1807 and had a daughter in 1808. He decided in 1809 that in what was termed a mill accident, some said that George castrated John for not being celibate. The fact that in 1806, John sued his father for trespass on land John brought near Salem, Ohio, and didn't drop the suit until 7 months later shows that there may have been some animosity between them that might have caused that. We will never know. Frederick Reichert was a close friend of George Rapp, and he actually lived in his house. He was put in charge of he was Rapp's representative while he was gone in America. As you may have guessed, George Rapp was a very charismatic man, having so many people following his teachings. Frederick was a stonemason and an architect. He knew law and business as well as art and music, and some termed him a Renaissance man. It's uncertain how or exactly when it happened, but George Rapp adopted Frederick as a son by the time Frederick arrived in America. He was then known as Frederick Rapp, and Frederick eventually became the business leader for the Harmony Society, and George Rapp was the spiritual leader. So if you go and see Old Economy Village, you'll hear about George Rapp, the founder, and Frederick Rapp, the business leader. So no one heard from George Rapp between the midsummer 1803 and February of 1804. He was just over there in America. In May of 1803, some Ulbrun separatists were imprisoned for meeting in a house after being told not to. So there's still more religious fervor that's being persecuted over there. They believed letters were held back. Frederick Reichert, then Reichert, was wrestled to know the will of God and was affected to the marrow of his bones. He became ill for 10 days and had to leave because he was overrun by strangers. He felt deserted by George Rapp. He finally received a letter in February from Rapp from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in October. 2 other letters were lost. Rapp's estate was put under arrest, and he was believed to have fled secretly. This is George Rapp's house in Iptingen. It's not there anymore. It was torn down. But 100 families or 500 people were ready to go in February of 1804. They found that property was hard to sell and no money could be raised because there were so many people trying to sell their property at the same time. But they hoped to be in Amsterdam by May, and new laws limited all action according to the principles, no force within us has remained untouched. That's what Frederick Rapp said in 1804. Michael Hahn wanted to bring his group within a year, and death was sworn to George Rapp if he ever returned. A man by the name of Gloss, his last name was Gloss, left in April with a group, and Frederick left in May with the next group. No one wanted to buy land because war was expected with Napoleon. Families were being split apart to leave, and some were too poor to leave. Some went to Russia and Hungary, and others to America. If the United States government could help pay, they would get 20,000 immigrants from Württemberg. That's the house that stood next to George Rapp's house in Iptingen today. So, on the way over to America, October 7th, 1803, the ship Canton arrived in Philadelphia from Amsterdam with George Rapp, his son John, who was a surveyor, and Dr. P.F.C. Haller, who later started his own colony in Lycoming County, and Dr. Christoph Mueller. So there were only 4 of them in 1803. So in September 1803, George Rapp went to Lancaster, PA, and had offers of land including 9,060 acres along the Conestoga River, about 1,500 acres towards Lake Erie, about 50,000 acres around Winchester, Virginia, and he soon headed into the backwoods with Haller. By February 1804, Rapp was in Columbiana, Ohio, on congressional land when Haller left to see a merchant in Baltimore about money. Rapp stayed in Columbia with a small German brotherhood and preached on Sundays. When the weather got better, he went to Tuscarora on the Muskingum River to talk with a Moravian Heckwelder and about land there. But with no money, he couldn't buy any land, and people kept buying up the land all around him. He was waiting for the money from his people in Germany. So he went to Baltimore to wait for his followers. So on July 4th, 1804, the ship Aurora came to Baltimore with 300 followers under the leadership of David Gloss. Later that month, July 12th, 1804, George Rapp petitioned Thomas Jefferson to help with payment terms to buy 40,000 acres on Sandy Creek of the Muskingum River in Ohio country at the time. Well, actually, it just became a state in 1803. So Congress was not convened at the time and would not decide anything. But the president was not allowed to decide this. So Rapp and his people had to wait still until Congress convened again. But they needed a place to live immediately. So Rapp went to Philadelphia to wait another ship, and everyone else went to Pittsburgh to meet up and then move to New Lancaster in Columbiana County, Ohio, where some actually purchased land and started a settlement. The next year, September 1804, the ship Atlantic came with 257 followers with Frederick Reichert Rapp. So a few days later, the ship Margaret came with more followers, and more came on other ships. The last group came a year later on August 26, 1805, on the ship Margaret, but they came and most of them settled in Blooming Grove in Lycoming County, Pennsylvania, with PFC Holler. That's another historic site that you can go see. Rapp didn't want to settle on the Muskingum River in Ohio, but financial problems caused him to choose. He did want to, sorry, but financial problems caused him to choose land, what's now Harmony, Pennsylvania, near Zillionople. You probably all know about Harmony, Pennsylvania, living around here. He kept all of his people out of bondage to pay for their trips through the goodness of people in Baltimore and Philadelphia. It was the way at the time. If you couldn't afford your payment to get over to America, people would be indentured, and those people were called redemptioners. People would pay for their trip over to America by having them work for them. So George Rapp made it so that no one had to do that. By the end of 1804, all of George Rapp's followers had put their money into a common treasury, and this was the beginning of their communist system. They all lived communally. We like to call it communal, but it really is an early form of communism. So in January 1805, 31 families started to work clearing the land and build the new town of Harmony. With $23,000, they had to buy the land, build a town, pay for tools, clothes, and food, and they were bankrupt by the middle of 1806. In February 15th, 1805 is the beginning of the Harmony Society in all actuality. This is the Articles of Association, which they all signed in 1805 to become the Harmony Society. There were between 450 to 500 members at the time, and it's kind of confusing about how many people there actually were, because the original Articles of Agreement were burned in the middle of the night while they were, it's like about 10 years later. So, they're building a town. Even though Christ was coming soon in their lifetime, and the Harmony Society were the holy chosen people, they had an obligation to excel and be a model in everything that they did. They built the town that was highly praised by everyone all around. They had a lot of people around them that really believed that they made good manufactures, and they were a great model for the surrounding areas. This is the town of Harmony on a map that was made in 1832, I think it was. 22, sorry. Anyway, it's an old map. So to tell you how well they built the town, here are some facts. Remember, they established the Harmony Society in 1805. So in the winter of 1804 and 05, they built 9 log cabins in which the first group of 40 families lived that winter. In 1805, they built 46 log cabins, a large barn, a grist mill with a 3/4 mile race, and cleared and planted 150 acres of corn, 40 acres of potatoes, 15 acres for meadow, and these are amongst many of their accomplishments that year. The next year, in 1806, they built an inn, a frame barn, an oil mill, a blue dyer's shop, and a tannery, and cleared 300 acres of corn and 58 acres for meadow. The next year, in 1807, They built a brick storehouse, which is still there in Harmony. They built a sawmill, a brewery, and they cleared 400 acres of grain and meadow and planted 4 acres of grapevines. Beginning their capitalist system, they began exporting that year with 600 bushels of grain and 3,000 gallons of whiskey. That's something I'm going to talk about later, is the capitalism and communism sitting side by side. In 1808, they built a meeting house, a brick dwelling house, and some other buildings, stables for cattle, a frame barn, and a bridge over the Connoquenessing Creek. And they cleared a lot of more land and sold 2,000 bushels of grain and turned 1,400 bushels into whiskey. I'm just getting tired thinking about it all. In 1809, they built a fulling mill, a hemp mill, an oil mill, and a grist mill, and then this brick warehouse, which is their museum building up in Harmony. And it had an arched wine cellar underneath, which you can see on tour there. Another large brick building cleared a lot more land, produced 6,000 bushels of Indian corn, 4,500 bushels of wheat, 4,500 bushels of rye, 5,000 bushels of oats, 10,000 bushels of potatoes, 4,000 pounds of flax and hemp, and 100 bushels of barley brewed into beer, and 50 gallons of sweet oil made from poppies. They sold 3,000 bushels of corn, 1,000 bushels of potatoes, 1,000 bushels of wheat, and distilled 1,600 bushels of rye. I think every year they're getting more and more productive. In 1810, they erected a wool carding machine and 2 spinning jennies to make broadcloth from merino wool. Built a frame barn and a brick building for 20 looms and a schoolroom. All of this was held in common, and people didn't use anything to extravagance. They used only what was needed. Here's some doorways that I think they used to exist in Harmony. I know the one on the left was torn down, and they saved the little angel at the top of the door frame. But I don't believe the other doors exist either. Members came from all walks of life and many different trades, all these different trades to make up a functioning community. They hardly had to buy anything. This is the cemetery gate at Harmony. It's a really neat gate. If you ever get a chance to go up there, and maybe you have, the door is all stone, and it still swivels on one axis. And you can try that up there. It's really neat. That's Harmony. The land purchased in Butler County didn't allow enough expansion to hold 2,000 people. Their land was fragmented because they had 3 towns around Harmony that a lot of people don't even know about. And strangers held land in between the Harmonist land. It was not all under their control, so they decided that they wanted to leave. The climate wasn't good enough for cultivating grapes to make wine. George Rapp was a vintner in Germany, and he wanted the Harmony Society to be producers of wine. The Harmony Society petitioned Thomas Jefferson in 1805 for 30,000 acres in the Western country. 200 men signed this petition, and most of them were heads of the family. After a month, the Senate passed a bill for George Rapp to buy land in Indiana Territory. But finally, nearly a month later, the House rejected the bill by 1 vote. They didn't want to give foreigners special financing to settle lands, even though the point was stressed about the merits of Germans and wine. So they decided to sell their town in 1814. This was just a decade after they started building the town. A party of 3 Harmonists were sent to Indiana Territory to look for new land. This was George Rapp, John Baker, and Ludwig Schreiber. They found land along the Wabash River that was a warmer climate and more fertile than Harmony, Pennsylvania, and it had access to water, but not enough of a drop that the mills needed for power. They started immediately buying land out in Indiana. In June 1814, there was a newspaper clipping that said, advertise for sale, town of Harmony with all improvements, 9,000 acres of land, including 3 villages, for $200,000. The three villages were Olbrunn, Aidenau, and Ramstal. The town finally sold in May of 1815 for $100,000 to the Mennonite Abraham Ziegler. That's Abraham right there, from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It took a long time for this to be paid, $100,000. That's okay. That was okay because the Harmony Society thought that they could have burned the town and made up the difference in 1 year, so that was okay. They were pretty wealthy. So in June of 1814, with $4,000 in cash, a company of Harmonists set out in 3 flatboats, holding 40 wagon loads of goods for the Wabash River to start building the new town. If you're not familiar with New Harmony, Indiana, and the Wabash River separates Indiana and Illinois, and they settled really far down south on that border, so almost to Kentucky. So to give you a little reference, about 3 years earlier, the Battle of Tippecanoe happened. This was a great Native American battle that had been fought not far from their new settlement. And just 17 months earlier, Captain Zachary Taylor fought off an all-night attack of Native Americans at Fort Harrison in present-day Terre Haute. This move, George Rapp believed, was necessary to fulfill their time in the wilderness, which was written in Revelations. That was symbolized as the woman in the wilderness. So George Rapp moved to Indiana Territory with all of his people, while Frederick Rapp stayed behind to manage the affairs of the Old Harmony. In all, the Harmony Society purchased 20,000 acres in Indiana. So their settlement was right here on the border of Gibson County and Posey County. So right in there was New Harmony, but they called it Harmony. They called it the New Harmony. But there was a lot of problems happening while they were trying to build this new town, because it was a different climate that they weren't used to. There were a lot of people dying of all sorts of illness. They had sickness on the way down to the new settlement. And there were a lot of people that were sick and dying of fever starting in the beginning of August of 1814. They were exposed to rain in their leaf-covered huts, which they were staying in while they were building the town. The season was much hotter than usual and drier and with little rain. So you had rain and no rain. I think we have seen that this year. The new town was surveyed and staked out by August. This is the town of New Harmony. But more people were getting sick and building could not very well proceed. With 3 builders, 5 carpenters, 4 masons, 2 drivers, and 1 clay hauler, and some others making shingles and clapboards. Just the healthy men started to build the town. But they were getting sick also. So, including John Baker, who was the head of these people in the Wabash pioneers. John Baker's mind got so weak that he could not even write or dictate letters. More supplies were sent in mid-September, but the fever epidemic had become disastrous, making work practically cease. Almost everyone in every family household was in bed with a fever, so that there weren't even people to help them survive, and many more died. With this news, George Rapp set off immediately to Indiana and reached there in October of 1814. There were hardly enough men to help unload the boat. He found that the doctor hadn't supplied enough medicine and that the food supply lacked many standard ingredients. He feared that many of the good brethren would die. Frederick Rapp also came out soon to take over affairs while John Baker was very sick. Another boat arrived before the end of November with a great deal of supplies and more people. There were 275 people there by November 1814. More boats arrived in December, and 2 harmonists died along the way and had to be buried along the river. The fever still continued, and many more people died. In the middle of December, Frederick Rapp set out and piloted a flatboat himself, day and night, to reach the Wabash. by Christmas to help start a store and have the Harmony Society become shareholders in Indiana Territory's first bank. He left in the beginning of January to go back to the old Harmony since it hadn't yet been sold. This trip may have shortened his life, causing health problems later in his life. The last of the Harmonists left in May of 1815 after Harmony was sold. Frederick Rapp is important to Indiana history. He represented the county at the Indiana Constitutional Convention, so he was one of Indiana's forefathers. He also helped to establish a permanent state capital at Indianapolis and probably helped lay out the town of Indianapolis. The Harmony Society even loaned the new state government $5,000 in a time when loans were hard to come by. That was a lot of money in 1814. So Indiana became a state in 1816. At this time, America was still struggling with the need to purchase goods at lower prices than what they could get from outside of America, versus trying to make industry succeed in America at higher prices. In 1816, Thomas Jefferson said that America should place the manufacturer beside the agriculturalist. The Harmony Society was a prime example of this. They were always putting manufacturing right beside agriculture. They called this the American system. The Harmony Society also fought for tariffs on imported goods to make American goods competitive and allow for growth of American industry. The society was always involved in agriculture, manufacture, and commerce, and they never let it interfere with the main goal of their life, which was to follow in the footsteps of Christ. This was the church in New Harmony, Indiana. This was something that George Rapp had a vision about. He thought that there should be a cruciform church in the shape of a cross. This church no longer exists in New Harmony. The Harmonists had it taken down after they left New Harmony to create the cemetery there. So they saved the doorway. That was while it was on the public school in New Harmony. And then this is George Rapp's house before it was torn down. All three towns had a labyrinth, and New Harmony recreated theirs in the middle of the 20th century. The philosophy of the Harmony Society was symbolically represented in the labyrinth, which they used to remind themselves of how difficult it was to reach the inner kernel of life with its circuitous and confusing paths. So, in 1824, they decided to sell the town again. Strange that they just built a new church, but very shortly before this, but they decided to move again. And they started advertising in English newspapers. And why they decided to move again was that they wanted more advantage in their in a new location for increased interest in manufacturers. Indiana was a very rural place at the time, and there just was not enough places to sell their things. They had poor mail facilities and poor communication with the East. They had unpleasant relations with their neighbors. The neighbors were not German and were suspicious of this large group of German immigrants settling near them. Their language was held against them in Indiana. The German language was more acceptable in Pennsylvania. Newspapers and laws were not written in German in Indiana, but they were in Pennsylvania. They also had currency problems, and they were not getting the justice that they thought they needed out there. So there were also biblical reasons for moving. So they believed that there was a time, and a half a time until Christ would return. So George Rapp took this to mean that a time was 10 years in Germany, a second time was 10 years in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and there was another time in New Harmony, 10 years, and then half a time until Christ would return. So that would be in 5 more years. So they were trying to be ready for that. Frederick purchased land 18 miles from Pittsburgh in May of 1824 the first part of the land that became economy, Pennsylvania. So they were selling 20,000 acres with all improvements, machinery left in place for $150,000. Robert Owen, this man, was a Scottish philanthropist and theoretical communist. He purchased the land in town in January of 1825 for $125,000. And he's credited as being America's first socialist. The first group of Harmonists left in May of 1824, and all of the Harmonists were gone by May of 1825, so within 1 year. So New Harmony is often more known by this man, by Robert Owen, and he's been on different programs lately about socialism in America. But he formed a new community that was not based on Christ, and it failed within a few years. So, the Harmony Society, to prepare for this move back to Pennsylvania, the river goes southward towards Louisiana from the Pittsburgh area, and so they needed a steamboat to go back up the river. They couldn't use flatboats. But steamboat technology was really coming about at this time, so they decided to build their own steamboat, which they called the William Penn, after the first settler in Pennsylvania. Many other boats were also used for transport to Pennsylvania. They named their new town Economy. There was already a Harmony, Pennsylvania, so they needed a new town name. And they named it Economy, but this isn't the idea of economy of today, like what we think of money and all that. Economy was the balance of all things. Just like harmony is, you want everything to be in balance. To them, it meant a divine economy, a city in which God would dwell among men, a city in which perfection in all things was to be attained. After 15 months, they already built a church, not this one. Oops, sorry. But this church was built by 1832. They built 100 houses, a large factory, that's their hotel they built. They also built a brickyard, a blacksmith shop, a cooper shop, wheelwright shop, tannery, saddler, apothecary, and chemical laboratory, a hat-making shop, a tailor shop, and a shoe shop. All within 15 months. In Economy, they had a winery. This is our wine cellar underneath the mechanics building, which was their tailor shop and their shoemaker shop. They had a brewery, a distillery. This is their cider mill. Does not stand anymore. They had a grist mill, the one on the left, and then on the right was their cotton mill. They also had a woolen mill and a silk mill. That's their cocoonery. Gertrude Rapp was the granddaughter of George Rapp, and she was the leader of the Harmonist silk industry. Their silk, this is some of their silk, was as good as that made in France and other countries. The Harmonist silk won 3 gold medals on a national level for superior silk. They fought for protective tariffs on imported goods to make American goods competitive. Gertrude and other leaders were always advising others around the nation about how to produce silk. The Harmonists made satins, velvets, jacquards, and ribbons. They operated a vertically integrated system by raising the silkworms and cocoons, growing the mulberry trees that fed the worms, reeling the silk, dyeing the thread, weaving the fabric, and finishing the woven goods. We do demonstrate silk reeling on occasion at Old Economy Village. We have a silk reeler there. They also had the first museum west of the Allegheny Mountains. It was the first public museum. They exhibited natural history and art there, and it was under the direction of Dr. Johann Christoph Müller. but it closed and was sold to some place in Pittsburgh in 1850. I think some of their collections actually are in the Carnegie museums. The museum was recreated in 2002 and is currently open to the public, so that's our recreated museum. We used all sorts of lists that the Harmonists had to figure out what should be on display there. The museum was housed in the Feast Hall building, in which the Harmonists celebrated their feast days about 6 times a year. So that's the Feast Hall on the 2nd floor. If you've never been there, it's an amazing space. In their agricultural pursuits, they stored 1 year's worth of grain in their 3 granaries. This is the granary that still exists on our historic site. But they wanted to have enough grain to prepare for Christ's second coming, to be able to feed all the people. When the Harmonists moved to economy, they worked in the fields themselves. This is their apiary, where they grew their bees, and they also had hops. These are all hops, and those are where the bees were kept. And they also have what looks like grapevines over there. But as they got older, they were celibate, so they didn't have children. As they got older, they hired people to work in the fields for them. These are some of their hired workers. Members didn't concern themselves with money. They got what they needed from the shop that made it. In this way, they weren't hampered in any way by concerning themselves with fashion. People were not fashionable. They kind of kept with their clothes that they were used to from way back in the 19th century. Hildegard Muchler is an interesting story. She was born in the society in 1806 and became a beautiful woman. She worked in George Rapp's garden and was close to George Rapp. But Jacob Klein was also interested in her, and in 1827, he was forced to leave because of this. And many Harmonists felt that this was very unjust. There was a lot of favoritism with George Rapp and Hildegard Muchler. She became George Rapp's virgin, in quotes, for his alchemy experiments, which was the practice of turning base metal into gold to prove that you were pure. So if you were pure enough, you could predict the second coming of Christ. So this situation caused a rift between George and Frederick Rapp, but because Hildegard became a closer confidant than Frederick was, and you remember Frederick was his confidant all the way from Germany. So this really created a rift. She escaped with the Harmonist doctor, Conrad Feicht, in the middle of the night and got married in 1829 in Wheeling, Virginia. And they had 1 child there. And then George Rapp allowed them back when they couldn't really afford to live there anymore. So they came back in 1833 and had 2 more children there. In economy. So this was a great problem for all the Harmonists. We're not allowed to have children, so what's going on here? So there was obviously not enough equality going on in this communal society. The Rapp houses were also a problem to people. If you've ever been to the George Rapp house, many of you have visited, you notice it's a lot more plush and decorated and everything than the rest of the people lived. We have the Baker house that shows how everyone else lived, and it is so stark in comparison to the place where the Rapps lived, which had wall-to-wall carpeting and wallpaper and nice furnishings. So there's just definitely not enough equality. That's the George Rapp house. You can see the feast hall in the background. And Frederick Rapp's house was connected to the George Rapp house. You can see a little bit of it on the right side of the George Rapp house. And this is the little Baker house. So, I have to tell you about this little story. This is all. So George Rapp predicted that at the end of the 3.5 times of the sun woman in Revelations, the woman walking in the desert, that Christ would return. So he thought that it would happen in September of 1829, and this time was coming, and many people were saying, hey, wait a minute, this isn't happening. Christ isn't coming, he's not showing up. But at the end of September in 1829, they received a letter from this man. This was Count de Leon. The letter had gold edges, 5 seals, and the coat of arms of the root of David, telling of the coming of the Savior, Count de Leon, the Lion of Judah, a descendant of Christ. It took him 2 years to finally get to economy. He came into the town with a large entourage of people, and bugles were blaring from the church tower. George Rapp and the Count met right away, and George knew that this was not the second coming of Christ. He was not the Messiah. So George Rapp and his entourage were allowed to stay because it was September and winter was coming, and they said, you can stay the winter, and but then you need to be on your way in the spring. So, but during that winter, they converted a lot of the Harmonists over to their side. They had all this inequality happening in a communal society, and they said, I think George Rapp is a tyrant, and we don't want to stay here, and we're going to go with you. So in March of 1832, there was a great schism that happened, and 1/3 of the society went away with Count de Leon to Philipsburg, which is now Monaco. And this is the Bible verse that tells about that. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. So the 1/3 of the stars were considered 1/3 of the Harmony Society. It was roughly 1/3 of the people of that whole Harmony Society left. It was around almost 250 people left at that time. That new group was called the New Philadelphia Society, and it lasted 1 year. Within that time, they had children. They were outgrowing the buildings that were there. That was a boat builder's place in Philipsburg, now Monaco. So they had purchased whatever buildings were there. They were all living in crowded places, and the people were unhappy that they weren't getting all of their money from the Harmony Society, which was supposed to be paid in 4 installments. And so in 1833, they came back to economy and caused war, in quotes, at economy. They demanded their payment. There was blood being shed in the streets at economy, and we have a blow-by-blow account of what all happened. This is when, if you've heard of this, boiling water was thrown out the window at the people that came back. So it's quite a time at economy. But none of these former Harmonists were ever allowed to come back to economy. And Count de Leon left in the middle of the night in 1833 in September and went down to Louisiana, where he established a community again. And so he left all these people that he brought with him from economy. And so some of them, they just scattered all over the country. Some of them went to Missouri to join Reverend Wilhelm Kiel in Missouri, and they eventually moved to Oregon and created Aurora, Oregon. There was a community there. Some of the former Harmonists became Mormons and went on the Mormon trail with them later in the 19th century. But the Harmony Society that was left after the schism was a more unified group of people and without many dissenters. But also in 1834, a blow to happened to the Harmony Society. Frederick Rapp died in 1834. They also had a woolen mill fire, which stopped their woolen production. That was a big source of income. And some people thought that it might have happened because some of the seceders set it on fire. But Frederick's health was getting worse, and he sought medical help in Philadelphia, but he died in June of 1834. And then George Rapp became both religious and business leader of the Harmony Society. So along came a national depression. In 1833, the veto of the United States Bank Charter by President Andrew Jackson created a panic in the money market and mercantile world. So the Harmony Society decided to take out all of their money from all of their banks. They lost $10,000 through just one Philadelphia firm alone. So they decided to take all of their money out. They had banks in Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Louisville, and they created what they called the church fund. They put it underneath the George Rapp House in one of the hidden vaults under there, which you can see on tour. They had supposedly 7 hidden vaults in economy, and we only know of 3 of them and possibly a 4th, but no one really knows, and that's one of the big things that people are interested in at economy. Where'd all the money go? So they wanted to use this church fund to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem whenever Christ returned. So this money that they took out of all of the banks helped the Harmony Society to remain solid during the Panic of 1837, when when bank after bank went under. Towns in the West collapsed, and Americans starved from unemployment. But the Harmony Society was doing well. And then George Rapp died in 1847. The newspapers thought that the Harmony Society would collapse without his leadership. They thought that was the end of the Harmony Society. But he was known as the greatest communist of his age. Just a year after he died in 1848, Marx and Engels wrote their Communist Manifesto. And there was actually some people that were coming to economy to see how the Harmony Society worked, to see how communism worked. But the big difference between the Harmony Society and modern day communism is that they never lost sight of their original purpose, which was to walk in the footsteps of Christ, to have an unselfish personality, and to work toward Christ's return. So that's what's missing in all of communism today, is there is no God. So the leadership was taken up by a series of trustees. See, I have more pictures, sorry. That's a fire, the economy crushing. Jacob Henrici was a very notable trustee in the Harmony Society's time. He was in charge of the Harmony Society for around 30 years. Many people looked at him kindly and just adored Father Henrici. But at this time also, a lot of the Harmonists were getting older. Like I said, they didn't have any children. They had to hire people to do their work for them now. And they started to turn towards investing their money. So they loaned money to companies all around the Pittsburgh area, greater Western Pennsylvania. When people defaulted, the Harmony Society actually purchased some of those companies and kept the former owner going in that employment to do the work. They purchased timberland in Tidioute, Pennsylvania, which they found oil on that property in 1859, which was just after the first oil was struck in America at Titusville with Edwin Drake. They operated the Economy Oil Company up in Tidioute. They purchased 2 small coal railroads, the Darlington Kennel Coal Railroad and the Little Sawmill Run Railroad. That's the oil industry up in Tidioute. This is the Darlington Kennel Coal Railroad engine, one of them. And then this is the Little Sawmill Run Railroad engine. So they owned shares in the coal business there. The Harmony Society also helped Pittsburgh in supporting their railroads to get the industry into town. Railroads came through in the 1840s and 50s in this area. The Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad dominated the east and west traffic for the railroads, and there was no railroad that went north and south. So they were very influential in getting the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad established in this area. They also donated some of their land in 1851 for the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad to come through their lands. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah. To tell you a little bit about their investments more, this is where it's wrapping up, is they owned most of the town of Beaver Falls, and they had a lot of industries there, including the Beaver Falls Cutlery and the Economy Pottery works there. They also had a bicycle company. They hired Chinese laborers there at the Beaver Falls Cutlery. They helped to establish the town, or the College of Geneva College in Beaver Falls, which moved from Northwood, Ohio in 1880. So basically, that was their investing. And then the Harmony Society eventually closed in 1905 with just 2 members left. And there's so much more to this story. But I know. I'll take any questions, though. Everyone is, yes.
The fever that killed so many people in New Harmony,
Yeah.
what was it? COVID.
It was malaria. As far as I understand, it was malaria. Yeah.
Malaria, really?
Yeah. It was, mosquitoes were really rampant around there, and they lived really close to the water. And there was a lot of flooding that happened in New Harmony, still is today. Yes?
How did their failed understanding of prophecy and the second coming of Christ affect? Didn't that not also cause dissension and consternation within the society?
Yeah, Christ wasn't coming back in their lifetime. They were seeing this, and they were getting very frustrated. So yes, there were many people that left throughout time, not just that 1832 schism. So that did happen. And people wanted to have kids and raise a family too, and they just weren't being able to do that here. Any other questions? Yes?
Present day situation down there, when you want to go see and visit, is there an entrance fee, and what else
Yes.
is involved in seeing the present day?
So if you want to go to Old Economy Village now, we have, sorry, got to go through John Duss. John Duss was in charge and took care of the rest of the society. There's a bigger story there.
A lot more information.
Yeah, a lot more. So we are open to the public Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And we're open 10 o'clock until 4 o'clock. And it costs $9 for seniors, $10 for non-seniors, and $6 for children.
Sarah, I got a question. I've been to the Old Economy Village, and outside of the area that you guys, quote, control, there seem to be structures that may have been part of Old Economy Village.
Yes.
Has there ever been an effort to try and reincorporate those structures within?
Some people have wanted to through time, but the Old Economy Village is owned by the state.
Right.
And that was a result of a court case in 1916. And so the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission is not currently taking more property. So that's always been what I've been told. You know, and the church across the street from us is not owned by the state. And that's one building that if that ever came available, I would think that we would want that, but I don't know what would happen. But there are around 80 houses still in existence in the historic district there. We did get 2 houses across the street from the site, but one of them was sold several years ago because it was held by the Friends of Old Economy Village, and they didn't think they needed that anymore. But we also have 1398 Church Street, and that was made into the Kinder House in 2007, I think. And we're looking at changing what we're doing with that building now too. But we do have one, so.
So is the city of Ambridge interested in, working with the Old Economy Village to, further its prominence within the state, or is it tourist destination?
We are currently working on trying to make Ambridge more pleasing to people to come to, because, after the decline, after the steel mills closed in the 1980s, everything really took a downturn in Ambridge, and people didn't want to come to Ambridge anymore. But if you've been to Ambridge lately, you see there's a lot more going on to make the town a better place to be. And I'm involved with Ambridge Heart and Soul, which is a national organization that is trying to see what people want out of their community and trying to make like a 5-year plan from what people want. So I'm involved with interviewing people that live and work in Ambridge and play in Ambridge to see what they want. So we're trying to do that. But a lot of people that live in Ambridge have never even been to Old Economy Village, and it's really sad. And we now have for several years had an Ambridge pass, so that people, whoever lives in Ambridge, can get in for free. And even still, it's hard. It's history, and history, I feel like, isn't as valued by everyone as much anymore, and that's really sad. So, I don't know. I don't want to leave that on a downturn, but I think good things are happening.
That's good.
Anybody else? Got a
Yes.
couple questions over there?
Yeah. Pennsylvania history
Here,
in the 60s.
the magic wall.
In the Pennsylvania history in 60s, when I was in school, in 9th grade, we made a trip to Old Economy.
Nice.
And at that time, they tell us they came from Harmony to Ambridge.
Oh, really?
None of what you told us today, they never mentioned to us.
Well, I think that they knew that too. I don't know why they said that, but they were still trying to research a lot of the stuff too. Like Carl Arndt, who was researching a lot, he was still researching and writing in the 1960s too. But they already knew that they went to New Harmony.
Because it was very run down at that time.
Yeah, 1965 is when it was reopened to the public after the restoration. And so it looked a lot better after that.
Because I was down there a couple of years ago, and it's all different, completely different.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Yeah, thank you. There was a question back there.
How were the assets of the Society Marshal when everybody was gone? Did they go to State Conservancy or?
John Duss.
Yeah, that's the part that I didn't get to in my presentation. So I don't know how to cut this short. 1892, John Duss became the head trustee. He said that there was never an accounting of the Harmonist money. So he forced Jacob Henrici in his last year that he lived, he had him make an accounting of the Harmonist finances. And he found out that they were actually in debt, but all of their money was tied up in all of these different companies and different places. So he said, this is according to John Doss. I know a lot of people think many different things about him, but he worked to try to free up some of that money. So he actually mortgaged all of their property at the end of that year, 1892, and then started to sell land in 1894. No one will ever actually know how much money they had. We cannot find any accounting. I don't know if the books were cooked. I don't know what happened. But in I think it was 1910 or 1912, I forget, there was a court case that was started because the tax collector in Ambridge started noticing that they weren't paying taxes and nothing was happening at economy. What's going on? Because supposedly a religious group cannot have any heirs, and all of the assets should be turned over to the state. So this was a court case that lasted until 1916, and it was found that the Harmony Society was never a religious community, and that they could have heirs, and that $15,000, I think, went to the state, and then the 1.5 blocks that is Old Economy now was turned over to the state at that time. All of the rest went to Florida, to the lawyers' pockets. I don't know. I have a feeling, and I would love to know more about this, but John Duss's lawyer was D.T. Watson, who was the starter of Watson School for Children, and I just hope that money ended up there, but we will never know.
That sounds incredible, considering the resources that could have been brought to bear by the state and others that might have had an interest at that time.
Yeah, and it's
Because it sounds like there was considerable industry and
Yeah.
assets at a point in time there that we don't know how was it ever dissipated, what happened?
yeah. And what's hard,
There were no Harmonists, so who got the money?
well, there were 3 former Harmonists still alive, and they were living in New Smyrna Beach, Florida.
I can add a little bit to this. My father was a very good friend of John Duss, and I grew up in one of the old Economite houses, and I'm a member of St. John's Lutheran Church, which has no relationship, by the way, as Sarah knows, to the Harmony Society. That case that she talks about went to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court ruled in John Duss's favor. There were probably several $1 million involved that went to John Duss and possibly 1 or 2 others. And there was no income tax at the time. And John Duss spent the money on his band, all right? And he wanted to be the next John Philip Sousa, and he wrote his own music. My father spent the winter at John Duss's house down in New Smyrna Beach in Florida as a 15-year-old. And I can remember John Duss coming to church after World War II and patting us young people on the head. And so, as I say, my father knew him extremely well, along with several other people in Ambridge. And it's a very fascinating story, and she's exactly right. No one knows how much money was involved. We know that some of the furniture ended up in France, and a lot of it ended up down in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. So, it's very convoluted. Also, by the way, they created a land company. Ambridge, I have the maps, the original maps. They were going to have Ambridge as a community of 100,000 people, and it was laid out. And also, they sold land to a company that we now know as American Bridge. to start the American Bridge Company down in Ambridge. And they also had a brickyard in Leachdale, as she talks about, and they had a variety of other investments. But it is a fascinating story, not only the society, but the dissolution of the society. And, Sarah, really, if you haven't ever been down there, go down there and go through the buildings. It's remarkable. And by the way, if you want to see the church, we have services starting at 10:30, and you can come at 11:30, and we'll be glad to give you a tour of the church, which is absolutely an unbelievable building, and it's all original with a few exceptions in the interior.
How come no one has ever taken on the task of writing a history of this thing? It seems like it's a...
Oh, no, she's right. No, Carl Arndt wrote 10 volumes, and John Duss wrote his memoirs.
So all this information you're just giving us is available in those books?
Yeah, Arndt books is available. John Duss talks about the society, and if you come to the church, there's a lot of people that know a lot about the church and how we obtained a church.
There's definitely stuff that was written about the Harmony Society, but there's things that aren't really well known, so they're not written about. And I'm digging and working on a book right now about, I started by trying to figure out where the Harmonists all lived, because we don't have a map that told that. So I'm just digging up all sorts of information so that isn't in a book. So about who the Union Company was and who the Liberty Land Company was and the Fort Pitt Improvement Company and the Ambridge Land Company. And there's a lot to this story. But one thing that I didn't say is John Duss rented out the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra for a summer. And he also rented Madison Square Garden for a summer to show Venice. He introduced water to Madison Square Garden and created Venice full of gondolas and bridges and all sorts of things. So that was 1903, I think, 1903. Pretty interesting. And if you've been to Ambridge, you might know that the longest street in Ambridge is Duss Avenue, so there's a reason for that.
Sarah, thank you very much for coming. I know there's a lot more to this
Thank you.
story that can be told. We'll have you back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.